Hello, how are we doing? Hi, I'm Greg Roskopf, and I'm the owner and developer of Muscle Activation Techniques. So thank you for joining this webinar today. We got a good group of people. We got a good number of people that have signed up for this. So we really want to, cover some principles of MAT and get questions. And one of the reasons that we sent out to have you send questions in ahead of time is because we saw the number of people signed up, and we want to make sure, in reality, trying to avoid the chaos, we want to make sure that we can answer some of the primary questions. So we'll start right away. We got an hour to go through some of the concepts. I'll go through the main questions that we deciphered through that were emailed to us, and start getting some answers, and I'm sure that will bring up some questions. But know that, we got a couple hundred people, over a couple hundred people signed up for this, so it would be very hard to take every question. So we really had to say, what are the primary questions, and what information do we want people to know and understand about MAT? And so I go from the first standpoint is literally, what is MAT? MAT is a biomechanically based process designed to identify and correct muscle imbalances that contribute to chronic pain and injury. And so we talk about that in the idea of the biomechanically based process. We basically look at the interrelationships of joints and understand how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput are interrelated. And with the idea that from a muscle activation technique standpoint, the idea is muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. So understanding this integrated system, we recognize that the integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. And so we literally look at the body movement by movement, muscle by muscle, to identify where muscles are not contracting effectively. And when they're not contracting effectively, we recognize that negatively affects the function of the body as a whole. So the integrated system does not work as efficiently when the isolated parts are not all contracting efficiently. So we are literally muscle specialists. And I come from a background, I have a master's degree with an emphasis in exercise science. So I come from that background. I don't come from the medical side of it. I started out as a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State in California. And it was my own personal injury that kind of led me into this process, and kind of the frustrations that I had with a fractured vertebrae when I was 19. By the time I was 25, through compensation and adaptation, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction. I literally had one injury after another. And the idea, and being in the strength and conditioning world, we want to get strong and we want to get flexible. And that was the idea in conventional rehab. We needed to maintain flexibility and increase the strength of the muscles. But those basic principles were not working for me. And I was chronically tight. And literally, whenever I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I literally couldn't get out of bed the next day because I had numbness and sciatica down into my big toe. And so it really brought out a lot of questions about the muscle system's role in chronic pain and injury. And working with athletes as a strength and conditioning coach, I would see certain athletes that got bigger, faster, and stronger with their exercise, and saw other people that they just kept breaking down. And I was one of those people. And so I was trying to figure out what are we missing from the standpoint, from a muscle-based standpoint, what are we missing when it comes to health and performance? And so that's kind of led to the development of MAT is my own personal injuries and the awareness that the questions that I asked as I was going through the conventional model. And so as a muscle specialist, one of the next things, the questions that come up is basically based off of what is MAT, is if you're familiar with MAT, we talk a lot about muscle tightness being secondary to muscle weakness. And now, we've been as definitive in that statement as muscle tightness is muscle weakness. And recognizing that tightness and weakness correlate together. So that's another question that came up when you say tightness is weakness. I mean, how are they the same thing? And how do they relate? And that's the next part about the principles of MAT and the foundational thought process that comes with MAT. Is muscle tightness is secondary to muscle weakness through the principles of MAT. And so when I had this fractured vertebrae, I told you I was chronically tight, but every time I would stretch and get deep tissue massage, I couldn't bend down to touch my, I mean, the next day I couldn't get out of bed. I could barely bend to touch my knees. I mean, I was so tight, but flexibility work did not work for me. And many times it actually made me worse. And so that brought out a huge question, like, why am I so tight? And so tightness was the focus. Whenever every specialist and every person I learned from in the field with biomechanics and its relationship to health and performance, every top specialist from physical therapy, chiropractic, massage, training, in every field, they focused, if they did assessments on me, is the reason that you have all these problems and these accumulation of injuries is because you're tight. But in every modality that I tried and attempted to work with on my body focused on that tightness, from anything from deep tissue massage to stretching to now you got foam rolling and dry needling and Theraguns, and you got all of these modalities or devices that are designed to help increase flexibility. And so the tightness was the focus in my rehab. And then I literally took a step back one day because things I understood the principles. I understood the interrelationships of joints and how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput was interrelated. And if you had abnormal motion at one joint, it could put increased stress on joints and tissues up the chain. It's like I understood all of that, but the application wasn't working. And I was seeing that with clients that were more in chronic pain. The processes that I was implementing in my work with my athletes and the general public was not working as effectively as I would have hoped. And so I took a step back and I said, why am I so tight? And literally, if we think about it, when we walk on ice, the first thing we do when we walk on ice is we tighten up as a protective mechanism. So the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it will tighten up as a protective mechanism. So walking on ice, it's an instability issue. Well, the same thing, and started recognizing that when you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So the muscles just don't fire the way they're designed to fire. They can't contract, the timing relationships are off, so they can't contract and contract on demand, and then they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect the body from injury. So it's an instability issue. When you have inflammation due to stress, trauma, or overuse, it creates an instability issue where the muscles can no longer do their job to stabilize joints. So the same way that when we walk on ice, when the body senses instability, that neurological response is tighten up and protect. And so I took a step back and said, well, maybe this tightness is a symptom, an underlying symptom to some other underlying instability issue. And that's what I started to find, is that when the muscles weren't contracting efficiently, opposite muscles would tighten up. So when a muscle loses its ability to contract effectively due to stress, trauma, or overuse, the muscle loses its ability to fully shorten. And that's an interesting principle. It loses its ability to contract effectively, so it loses its ability to fully shorten. And through reciprocal inhibition, when a muscle contracts, the opposite, you have an inhibitory response sent to the antagonist muscle, and that antagonist muscle will let the agonist muscle move through its full range of motion. But when you have muscle inhibition or muscle weakness due to, i.e., what I say, loose battery cables, where these communication pathways have been altered, you have muscle inhibition. The muscle loses its ability to fully shorten, and the opposite muscles no longer get that inhibitory response, so they end up being tight. So if I was to flex my bicep and I lost the ability due to overuse and inflammation, I lost the ability to contract efficiently, it's like, oh, I can only contract. I can't get it into end range motion and my triceps are tight. So when we see that, when we see somebody with tight hamstrings, we think, oh, we need to stretch the hamstrings or we need to loosen up these hamstrings. And we have to think the opposite. is what muscles move you into the position of hip flexion. And so we actually have the hip flexors that are actually the issue here, is that the hip flexors become the problem. And the hip flexor weakness can actually cause hamstring tightness. And so overuse on the hip flexors can cause the hamstring tightness. And we've probably all seen that. You ever have somebody that stretch their hamstrings to death day after day after day? And this was my problem. For 10 years, I could barely touch my knees. And the opposite muscles, the muscles that actually, would lengthen the hamstrings, are the hip flexors and abdominal muscles. And so due to the fractured vertebrae and compensation over time, I had a hip flexor and abdominal weaknesses or imbalances that actually caused my hamstring tightness. So I would stretch my hamstrings to death day after day, and I never got more flexible. And the interesting part, jumping ahead, is when I developed MAT. As soon as I got the abdominals and hip flexors activated, I reached down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years. Because the abdominals and hip flexors are the muscles that move you into hip and spinal flexion. When those muscles were weak, they couldn't fully shorten. And due to the law of reciprocal inhibition, the opposite muscles would not lengthen, which means those opposite muscles were showing up as being tight. So the loose battery cables and the impeded information from the nervous system was on the anterior muscles. The tightness showed up on the posterior muscles. And as I started working with these principles, I was a range of motion guy. When I started, I learned every modality and every technique, from mobilization techniques, deep tissue work, PNF stretching. I learned every technique to try and increase range of motion. And as I started recognizing the principles of MAT, that this tightness is secondary to weakness, all of a sudden I had to think the opposite. Instead of putting the focus on the tight muscles, I needed to put the focus on the weak muscles, hence muscle activation technique. So that actually creates that foundational principle. Is why do we look at muscle weakness as a component of muscle tightness? Because muscle weakness causes tightness. And the important part about that is it's a neurological response. These muscles just aren't adhesed and tightened up and just fibrous due to the mechanical properties of the muscle. They're tight because the nervous system is saying, I'm not going to allow you to relax. I'm going to maintain tension in these muscles and not allow you to relax because we have an instability issue on the opposite side, i.e. walking on ice. The body will tighten up as a protective mechanism. And as I said, the body, the weakness, when a muscle can't contract effectively, it can't shorten effectively. So the further and further that muscle moves into the shortened position, the less functional it is. And it's a sensory input issue based on the muscle, the information coming from the muscle spindle. When you have inflammation or muscle inhibition, the further and further that the muscle moves into the shortened position, the interfusal fibers that make up the muscle spindle go under slack, and they can no longer provide sensory feedback back to the nervous system. And when the sensory receptors cannot provide input to the nervous system can't create the motor response required to resist the force. So the shortened position of a muscle when you have weakness is the most vulnerable position of that muscle. It's where the muscle is almost paralyzed. So the last thing the nervous system would want to allow is the body to move into a position where it's vulnerable or a position of instability. So a natural protective mechanism by the body is, I'm going to tighten up to not allow you to move into a position of instability. So that's our foundational principle. Muscle tightness is secondary to weakness. When the body senses instability, it will tighten up to protect the body from moving into positions of instability. And you think about as we get older and we get more protective in our movement patterns, we shorten our stride length, we become stiff, we revert ourselves toward the center of gravity, the same way people do when they walk on ice. So it's the same processes through the nervous system that the body goes into a protective state when it senses instability. And when from a muscular standpoint, we're looking at that instability as an intrinsic mechanism. When we're walking on ice, it's an extrinsic mechanism that causes that protective tightening. So that's why we focus on muscle tightness or muscle weakness in order to improve muscle tightness. So the goal with MAT, like I said, when I reached down to touch my toes for the first time in 10 years, the goal is to melt the ice, provide a sense of stability, and the body will give you all the mobility in the world. And that's the goal of MAT, improve the ability for muscles to contract. It improves their ability to fully shorten, which means that it can tolerate forces in the extremes of range of motion. So the opposite muscle say, oh, I don't have to tighten up to protect you from moving into that extreme anymore because I know you're stable there. So the goal is melt the ice, and then the body will give you all the mobility in the world. And so the next question that has come up, I mean, multiple times in this question is, you talk about muscle weakness. How can somebody be strong and still be weak and still have inhibition? That's an interesting question, because the word weakness thinks, well, he can only bench press 80 pounds. And I mean, his brother can bench press 350. So he's weak. But we're not talking about strength when we're talking about muscle weakness or muscle inhibition. When we're talking with the principles of MAT, we're talking about instability. And that was a hard part for me to comprehend at the beginning, because I'm like, well, I'm tight. And this tightness, when we use the analogy of walking on ice, this tightness relates to an instability issue, and we can call it muscle weakness. And we use manual muscle testing to identify where the weaknesses are. But the manual muscle testing that we perform is not a maximum contraction test. It's we're not trying to see how much force, or like a brake test. We're not trying to say how much force can you resist, and you gave out at 50 pounds of force, or you gave out at 25 pounds of force. It's more of a neurological test when we perform our muscle testing. It says, can the muscle contract? Can it contract on demand? And can it sustain that contraction? So basically, is there a strong connection between the nervous system and the muscle system? As I said, when you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So it's like having loose battery cables. The information just doesn't get there. It's kind of sluggish, and you have a dimmer switch on the muscles. So it takes longer to get a muscle contraction and to produce the amount of force required to stabilize joint. How can there be muscle weakness when someone can squat 400 pounds or bench press 350 pounds? How can they come in from a neurological standpoint? And that's where I was going with that, is it's a neurological weakness as opposed to a force output weakness. And even when you have a neurological weakness, it's going to show up as weakness. When we perform our muscle tests, like I started to say, if you were to push with 50 pounds of force, and they could contract until they gave out at 50 pounds, it's like, okay, that's the strength capacity that they have. And then I've seen people where we use force dynamometers, and when they come in with muscle inhibition, they give out at 50 pounds of force on one side, and the weak side, they may give out at 35 pounds of force. And once we reestablish communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, all of a sudden, on a brake test, that strong muscle, or the weak muscle, which could only produce 35 pounds of force, now will give out at 50 pounds of force. So we are definitively saying there's a weakness in the muscles when there's a neurological deficit. But these weaknesses don't show up across the board. Well, I can bend, or I can, let's say it was a glute, and I'm using an example of a pro hockey player who had a patella tendon, or a patella fracture, and his glutes, and when he was coming back from rehab on the patella side, were weaker. They were inhibited. And we improved his force output from 35 pounds of force on a brake test to 50 pounds of force, and before he would give out. So he came in weaker, and from a strength standpoint, but he was still working out every day. He was still playing hockey, and he knew he had a deficit because he had the patella tendon, the patella fracture. But there's athletes out there all the time that have weaknesses. But when they have weaknesses, their body is so good at compensating. I keep getting things showing up on my screen. The body is good at compensating for those weaknesses. And so I've had guys come in and they're strong as can be, but they got knee pain and back pain, and they have all of these physical issues, even though they're strong. And that's what I realized, even when I was figuring out MAT and I had all these residual problems after the fractured vertebrae. I was a strength coach. So I was working out, I was squatting 500 pounds, bench pressing 400 pounds, but I was unstable. And it's funny the way that we address instability. I would put knee wraps on when I'd squat. I had orthotics. I'd wear a weight belt. I'd use all these artificial devices to try and create some form of stability, because I had strength, but I didn't have stability. And that's the key. Can the muscles contract and contract on demand to do their job to stabilize joint? So even though I could move a lot of weight and lift a lot of load, I wasn't stable through those motions. And so now we go back to the idea that stress, trauma, and overuse and the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. When the muscles can't contract efficiently, it's this inflammation negatively impacts the slow twitch muscle fibers. So it's a slow twitch muscle fibers actually begin to pick up fast twitch characteristics. And the primary, they knew there's metabolic changes that occur when you have inflammation. Well, we think fast twitch, strong, strength. Well, one of the main factors that's affected when you have inflammation is the threshold to activation of these slow twitch fibers get high. So the metabolic characteristics of these fibers have changed so that the threshold to activation gets higher, which means it takes more electrical current in order to create a contraction. You think slow twitch fibers are the muscle fibers that actually maintain upright posture and help to work to stabilize joint. And now these slow twitch fibers pick up fast twitch characteristics. They fatigue much faster, and they don't fire on demand, and they can't do their job to stabilize joints. And that means they can't do their job to protect us from injury. So I was wearing a weight belt and wearing knee wraps and had orthotics, all to try and provide an artificial sense of stability and do what the muscles were supposed to do. My biggest problem through that whole time where I had chronic pain and dysfunction, I was literally 25 years old saying, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? Because I was on this downward spiral, one injury after another. And it was because my muscle system was failing. And so all the aches and pains that we relate to aging have to do with failure of the muscle system to be able to stabilize joints and tolerate forces. And muscle activation techniques, the goal is improve muscle contractile ability, increase the slow twitch characteristics of the muscles, or the oxidative capacity and the timing relationship, so the muscles can contract on demand, and do their job to stabilize joints and protect us from injury. So people can have weaknesses, but weaknesses correlate with instability, not about how much weight you can lift. You can be strong, but you can be unstable. We want to make sure you're stable and strong. And so next question, MAT, you say you don't treat pain. Why? I guess from an MAT standpoint, if there's any practitioners out there listening, or if you've been associated with any MAT practitioners, you can say one thing is what gets people to an MAT practitioner? Pain. My knees hurt. Myself personally, my knees hurt or my back hurt, patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis. I was desperate. I was going out from specialist to specialist to try and figure out how to get healthy. So that leads people to try and get healthy. But from an MAT perspective, we're not treating pain. We're treating muscle dysfunction. I don't have the license to diagnose or treat pain. I'm come from the exercise science standpoint, strength and conditioning side of it, but I do have the ability to improve muscle function. That's my specialty. And that's how we teach our courses, is to teach people how to improve muscle function. We're the muscle specialists. And our whole goal is to improve the contractile capabilities of muscles. And when we understand the interrelationships of joints, again, how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk are all interrelated, and that we understand in weight-bearing activity, you could have abnormal motion in the foot, and it could be putting increased stress on your knee or your hip, and the pain could show up far away from where the dysfunction is. And so the greatest thing about muscle activation techniques is people can come in and tell us where their physical complaints are, but what we look at is how do you move? I don't care what you can do. I want to know what you can't do, because what you can't do is breaking you down. So how do you move? Oh, I can't turn my head to the right like I can turn it to the left. Or, oh man, when I lift my left arm, it doesn't go as high as my right arm. And you start to see these asymmetries or imbalances. And what you can't do, again, muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. So and the first sign of instability or muscle weakness is muscle tightness, correlating muscle tightness. The second sign is the body shouts out in pain, saying, fix the problem. So I always say pain is your check engine light. It's basically saying something's wrong, but understanding the interrelationships of joints and how problems could be somewhere else, putting increased stress on another joint and tissue, causing pain far away from the injury. We look at pain as the check engine light. When your check engine light comes on in the car, you don't say, oh, there's the problem on the dashboard. You take it, what do? You take it to a mechanic, and you take it to the mechanic, and the mechanic lifts up the hood, and it starts to evaluate how the intrinsic mechanisms of that car, which I don't understand anything about, but it evaluates to determine what is wrong. So pain is saying something's wrong, and that dysfunction could be under the hood. It could be far away from where the pain is, i.e. the check engine light that's on the dashboard. And so with muscle activation techniques, we use range of motion assessments to tell us what's wrong. So somebody can come in with a knee problem, patellofemoral syndrome, and that we could do an evaluation and check their foot, and they have great range of motion in the foot through all planes and every motion. And then you go to the hip, and it's like, ooh, at 90 degrees of hip flexion, they have no internal rotation. Well, internal rotation is a component of shock absorption, and the other end of the femur is at the knee. And so if the femur's not moving properly at the hip, it's not moving properly at the knee, and that could cause increased stress and eventual patellofemoral syndrome. And so it means that the muscles that internally rotate the hip were not contracting effectively, leading to potential problems in the knee. And so, I mean, it's definitely, people are looking at it from a biomechanical process in many modalities, but the idea with muscle activation techniques is we definitively look at one thing. How are the muscles contracting? Can the muscles move the joints the way they're designed to move the joint? Structure dictates function, but it's the function of the muscles that dictate whether or not the structure can move the way it's designed to move. When muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't move the bones effectively. So it's like, oh, I can't turn my head to the right. It's not that my left rotators are tight, it's that my right rotators can't shorten effectively. If I can't lift my head or my arm into shoulder flexion, it's not that the extensors are resisting me from moving there, it's that the flexors are unable to fully contract and fully shorten. And the goal with MAT through a range of motion assessment is to say, where can't you move? And when you can't move in the position, it tells us that one or more of the muscles that cross that axis are potentially weak. Then we go through and we test and treat each of the muscles that have a component of function, say of moving you into shoulder flexion. And testing and you treat the muscles. I always say, I don't care what you can do. I want to know what you can't do, because what you can't do is breaking you down. So which muscles, this is a complex joint through scapular motion, clavicular motion, glenohumeral joint motion. The rotator cuff muscles have to hold the head of the humerus and the glenoid. All of those muscles have to be able to contract and contract on demand in order to do this. And so which muscles can't contract and contract on demand? Because they're the ones that are causing protective tightness. Because it says, I'm unstable in that position, so I'm not going to let you move into that position. The nervous system is smart. It's smarter than us. And so we, instead of us thinking, oh, I think this is weak and this is tight, we have the tools to be able to assess. Through MAT, that's our whole goal, is to be able to assess what you can and cannot do. Which muscles can contract and which muscles can't. Limitations in range of motion. I was a range of motion guy, I started to say, and I did range of motion assessments on all my clients, but I always performed those range of motion assessments in order to determine what was tight. Now we go through thorough range of motion assessments throughout the body to determine what is weak. When you have a limitation in range of motion, it means that the muscles that move you in that position can't contract effectively to fully shorten. And then the opposite muscles tighten up to protect you from moving into that position. And so one of the things that come out is in MAT, and you've seen it, is stretching is bad. We've heard, MAT, that stretching can be bad for you, and deep tissue massage can be bad. And one of the first things I said is, I would stretch and get deep tissue massage, and I couldn't get out of bed the next day because I had numbness and sciatica down in the big toe. Does that mean stretching is bad? So I don't know. The only way that we know if it has a positive or a negative effect is to having the ability to assess. It turns out in my situation, my weaknesses on the hip flexor abdominal side were causing a protective tightness on the posterior side to the hamstrings and erector muscles, which in turn, was protecting. And if you violate a protective mechanism, negative things can happen. If I didn't have an injury prior to the injury, I played sports my whole life, 17 years of football. This happened in my 15th year of football that I had the fractured vertebrae. We stretched my whole life. So does it mean stretching's bad? Or does it mean in this situation, did stretching have a positive or a negative effect? You could stretch somebody's hamstrings and not have a problem. You could stretch their hip flexors and all of a sudden it could overload tissues that are already vulnerable and cause weakness, and that weakness causes protective tightness and then eventually pain if you keep putting forces on the body. There is research out there, and in 2011, the American College of Sports Medicine did a position paper on stretching, and they basically found that, three main factors: a compilation of all the research out there on stretching that said it does nothing to create long-term changes in flexibility. It doesn't have an effect to increase range of motion, long-term to create changes, long-term changes in range of motion, and to get rid of muscle soreness. So it doesn't make long-term changes in flexibility. It doesn't do anything to reduce muscle soreness, but the main factor was it can reduce the force output by up to 50%. It can reduce the force output of the muscle for up to an hour. So the muscles would actually be weaker. And I think if any of you out there have played sports and going to be active, the last thing you want to do before you go run a 100-yard sprint or play on the football field is make yourself weaker. And I found over time, the more stressed somebody's nervous system is or neuromuscular system is, the more vulnerable they are, the longer these diminished activation or strength levels of muscles occur. And so I don't say that anything's good or bad. The research shows that information. Practical work on a day-to-day basis says, you know what, if there's a vulnerability, then stretching could have a negative effect. If those tissues are trying to tighten up and protect to protect you from moving in positions, the last thing you want to have is mobility without stability. If you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. So we're only as good as the motion we can control. Now, the positive side, if I stretch you and stretch your hamstrings, I may open up a range that's unstable. On the opposite side of it, if I activate the hip flexors and abdominals and I increase range of motion by getting these muscles contracting more efficiently, I've increased stability. So now you're stable through a greater range of motion. So the nervous system will give you that motion, i.e. melting the ice, when it recognizes that it's stable. So rather than forcing motion on the body, with MAT, what we're doing is we're creating the ability for the body to move the way it's designed to move. When muscles can contract effectively, the opposite muscles won't tighten up. So it's a safer process. You can have mobility and stability together, whereas if you stretch, it's not to say stretching is bad, but how do you know whether you opened up a range that's unstable? You can increase flexibility by increasing blood flow circulation, and it may not have opened up a range that's unstable. They just needed to be loosened up. On somebody else, you could increase flexibility and find out that, ooh, that just opened up a range that's unstable. But how do you know? And with muscle activation techniques, that's the greatest thing, is we can test it. If I was to stretch somebody's hamstrings, you think about what I'm doing. I'm stretching the hamstrings, knowing with an understanding that the hip flexors could be potentially weak, and that may be why the hamstrings are tight. After I stretch somebody's hamstrings, I can go back and test the hip flexors, the psoas, the tensor fasciae lata, the rectus femoris, the sartoria. I can test the hip flexors to make sure that it didn't create a weakness. As long as they have mobility and stability, then we'll take all the motion in the world. But what if you just stretch their hamstrings and it violated a protective mechanism, and you come back and say, oh, now the hip flexors are weak, we have a psoas weakness and a tensor fasciae lata weakness, we have an unstable environment. And that's why so many times people stretch day after day after day and they continue to tighten right back up, Because the minute you put force back on the body says, oh, I got to go right back into my protective state, and it tightens up again. You have to melt the ice. But if they go right out and sprint and go out on the field and do something at high intensity and they're unstable and they're weak, they've been weakened because of the passive stretch, then injuries can happen. That's when they're the most vulnerable. Again, tightness is the first sign. Second sign is the body shouts out in pain saying, quit doing this until you fix the problem. So there's many issues related to MAT and how we address the body. And it's all about the body's ability to tolerate force. And we'll go to that if we talk about force tolerance levels. One of the questions that came in is, does MAT help with people that have chronic ankle sprains and repetitive ankle sprains? And think about that. Again, if I go back to one of the primary principles that I talked about, is muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. And so if you sprain an ankle, you basically have overloaded the tolerance level of the muscles. Muscles have the contractile ability to stabilize joints. Ligaments don't. Ligaments are our secondary tension regulators. And so when the muscle system fails, which means it gets overloaded, the Golgi tendon organs fire and exceed the input from the muscle spindle, all of a sudden you have an inhibitory response. Now the muscles get out of the way and part of the protection of the nervous system. But when the muscles are no longer contracting and stabilize the joint, the ligaments take that stress and now you sprain an ankle. So you have ligament damage. But think about it from a force tolerance level. What do you do after you sprain an ankle? You limp. You can't put any pressure on it. Why can't you put any pressure on it? Because it hurts. Well, why does it hurt? Because the muscles that support the joint can't tolerate the force. And now you're putting total body weight, ground reaction forces, momentum. You're trying to put all these forces on tissues that have just been damaged as you after you sprain that ankle. And so the main key about that is, again, muscles have the ability to stabilize joints, ligaments don't. The ligaments are your secondary tension regulators. So the ligament gets sprained because the muscles fail. Pain, there's an inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception. So when mechanoreception, the sensory input, I talked quickly about the muscle spindle and the intrafusal fiber going under slack. So when you have inflammation, it's the sensory input that you lose coming from the particular muscle. So those muscles can no longer provide proper feedback. Everything's tightening up and protecting. And it's like you have a brace on your ankle. You're unstable, you're tight, and it's painful. And so the goal, there's an inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception, which basically said mechanoreception being the muscle spindle, the sensitivity of the muscle spindle. Inflammation decreases the sensitivity of the muscle spindle to not provide sensory input, which means it increases the sensitivity of the nociceptors. So it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. When muscles are weakened, it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. So you injure the muscles, you damage the muscles and ligaments, and you have an inflamed joint. When you sprain an ankle, you no longer have the strength to tolerate the forces of body weight, momentum, gravity, all of those forces. And so the body shouts out in pain. As we get muscles activated, all of a sudden, increase the sensitivity of the muscle spindle, it starts to take less physical or more physical stress to create that same pain response. And all of a sudden, someone, ooh, I can walk on that better. And then next thing you know, it's like, okay, all the muscles are activated, they're staying strong, their tolerance levels are higher. And it's like, okay, now I'm healed. My ligament, you provide an environment so the ligaments and the passive structures of the joints can heal when you increase muscle activation. Now we go back to chronic ankle sprains, and everybody has a history. Everybody's body has a history. Like, ooh, I sprained my ankle bad when I was in high school, and I tore my ACL my first year of college, and then I end up now I'm 40 years old and I have SI joint dysfunction and some disc injuries. And all of a sudden, it's like all of these injuries have a history. And your body, your nervous system, saying basically we didn't fully repair our ankle. We didn't, then that put increased stress on the knee and set us up for an ACL tear. Now we have instability working up the chain because all the muscles haven't been fully reprogrammed to be able to stabilize the joint. Just like somebody that has repetitive ankle sprains over time, because those muscles, they have a history. And so those muscles have progressively gotten weakened because they've never had their battery cables tightened. And that means they're always more vulnerable than what their potential of strength should be. And so the same thing, then adaptation, compensation, you put increased stress on other joints and tissues, and you just see this pathway of the body going through one injury after another. And it all comes down to muscle dysfunction. Muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. When muscles aren't contracting effectively, then they can't do their job to properly stabilize joints. And then they can't tolerate forces. When they can't tolerate forces, we're more prone to injury. So the body compensates for all of our weakness. And then there's a certain point in time that all the aches and pains that we relate to aging literally have to do with failure of the muscle system. Because there's a certain point in time where you no longer have enough strong muscles to compensate for the weak muscles. And that's when Pandora's box opens up. And that's when you have one injury after another. Then you're getting knee replacements, hip replacements, because you're driving your car with bad alignment. All these muscle weaknesses and imbalances, when you got abnormal, more pull on one side than the other, that, I mean, basically changes the wear and tear on joints, and decreases the surface area of wear, and you start getting degenerative joints because you have abnormal pull from the muscles. Muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. When the muscles aren't contracting, you can't hold the bones in proper alignment. So the goal with MAT, not anybody. I mean, one of the questions is who is MAT for? MAT is for anybody that has a muscle system. Life is going to beat us up. From a neuromuscular standpoint, life is going to beat us up. We go out and we go play a sport, or we're a weekend athlete, and we physically stress our system. We get inflamed. Inflammation shuts down muscles. When we're young, we're able to heal and recover more effectively, and we go back and do it the next day or the next week. As we get older, our tolerance levels get lower, and we don't heal like we did when we're younger. And we end up in this chronic state of inflammation. And that chronic state of inflammation means muscle weakness throughout the body. And that muscle weakness throughout the body means that we're more prone to injury. We can't tolerate as much force. It takes less physical stress to create a pain response. So the more dysfunctional our muscle system is, the more pain we have, because of that inverse relationship between mechanoreception and nociception. And so multiple questions here. One of the questions, how is MAT different than coupled with neurokinetic therapy, muscle energy techniques, different other applied kinesiology? I'd say MAT takes a very biomechanical approach to this process, looking at from the interrelationships of joints and how all joints are interrelated, and recognizing that probably the main key is we use range of motion as our indicator of potential problems. We go through a very specific muscle-specific range of motion assessment that basically allows us to tell us where there's potential weaknesses. Once we go through that range of motion assessment and identify where there's potential weaknesses, we have the ability to test and treat and reactivate those muscles, i.e. tighten battery cables, which in turn improves the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. As you improve that communication, strength improves, range of motion improves. You gain mobility and stability. That's probably one of the few modalities I know that actually makes you stronger on the spot. And I think, but the very specific process of range of motion leading to muscle testing, leading to activation, and the end result being reassessed for range of motion, for muscle contraction, then range of motion, you see specific changes relative to the mechanical properties at each joint. So a very specific process. Again, who is it for? Can you use it with special population? Who's it for? Everybody, anybody that has muscles. Again, life's going to beat us up. And you think about NASCAR when you go and drive your car, and high speeds, they're racing their cars, and they come into the pit and you have 10 people jumping on the car and balancing the tires and trying to tune it up quickly. And then in between races, they take it back to the mechanic. And I actually had a client in here yesterday that owns a NASCAR group, and he was telling me, he had like 100 employees that just take care of the cars, all these mechanics, and they're all specialized back in North Carolina. And it just, I mean, it's like the amount of money they pay and the amount of work that has to be done to keep those cars working at a high level. I said to them, it's like we treat our bodies better than we treat we treat our cars and horses better than we treat our bodies. It's like we'll put the time and energy in, recognizing when you drive a car at high speed, you got to tune it back up so you can go drive it again at high speed. We take our bodies, we drive at high speed, let it break down, and then hopefully it will recover and you go drive it again, and you start to see continual deterioration over time, especially the older we get. We need to treat our body like we treat our cars. And from a neuromuscular standpoint, that's what MAT is about. Life's going to beat us up, and from a neuromuscular standpoint, somebody's got to be there to put you back together so you can go perform at a high level again and stop that downward progression that we relate to aging and start getting people able to do the things that they used to do when they were younger. That's the whole goal of MAT. So the question in general was, do you have experience with scoliosis? And I mean, how, if yes, how could you correct or help somebody with scoliosis and these spine curvatures? And so you think about it, I have a scoliosis. And ironically, there's a difference between a structural scoliosis and a functional scoliosis. I mean, due to muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. And when people are diagnosed at a young age with a scoliosis, you can see a structural change where you actually, you see bony changes in the structure. And so let's say somebody has a 10-degree scoliosis and they're functioning fine when they're younger, and all of a sudden they start to compensate because every time they move, like I take myself, I side bend to the right, opposite rotation. So my scoliosis is to the right. Every step you take functions about timing. So every step you take, you're reinforcing that side bend to the right, but never really getting the side bend to the left, because the gait cycle, I mean, in less than a second, you go from heel strike to same side heel strike. You never really get and reinforce the side bending to the opposite side. So over time, that 10-degree scoliosis, which you can't change structure, the structure dictates the function. So that 10-degree scoliosis is what somebody had, but they didn't have pain then because the muscle system could handle the stresses coming with that 10-degree scoliosis. But then due to adaptation over time, certain muscles get overstressed, overused, and all of a sudden that 10-degree scoliosis becomes a 17-degree scoliosis. Now they have abnormal pressure on discs, and facet irritation, and they have more pain. And so the idea is, yeah, we can't do anything about the 10-degree scoliosis, but the 7-degree, the adaptation, the functional scoliosis, the adaptive mechanism that occurred due to muscle weaknesses can be addressed. And if you can get all those muscles activated and being able to tolerate the force of that constant side bend and rotation, when they can tolerate the forces, all of a sudden that posture goes back to a 10-degree scoliosis rather than a 17. And because muscles are contracting more effectively, they're stabilizing joints, there's higher sensitivity of the muscle spindle, which means it takes more stress to create a pain response. You can take the stress off of the joints and tissues by improving muscle function in somebody with a scoliosis. The same thing with knee valgus or a pronated subtalar varus, forefoot varus when you're dealing with foot mechanics. It's like the structure dictates that there may be abnormal stresses being placed on the muscle system, but why? If somebody had a scoliosis or a forefoot varus or a rear foot varus that we would classify that this is the reason for your back pain, why didn't they have back pain when they began to ambulate? The back pain didn't come on till years later when they're 30 years old or 35 years old. And then we can say, oh, it's because of your scoliosis or it's because of your foot structure. It's like, no, it's because the muscle system is no longer tolerating the forces that that foot structure dictates. The foot structure dictates that it's going to put muscles at a mechanical disadvantage. It's when can the body no longer handle those forces related to that structure. So how long can a muscle stay facilitated after achieving MAT work? Again, this is muscle activation techniques. So the whole idea is that we want to get the muscle activated, tighten battery cables, and improve the ability to contract and contract on demand. But it's all about force tolerance. And so depending on somebody, if I have an 18-year-old kid, like the guy I talked about NASCAR, his son was a 17-year-old golfer down at the IMG Academy and looking to perform at the high level in golf and really progress with it. And When they're young and athletic, he was a mogul skier. When they're young and athletic, it's like you can kickstart the muscles and it's like send them on. But then let's take, say, the 50-year-old man that came in. He's been sitting at a desk his whole career, and all of a sudden it comes in and he's totally dysfunctional throughout his body. He's got systemic inflammation, which causes the muscle tolerance levels to be lower. And when the tolerance levels are lower, you can get the muscles activated, and then you may find they go and golf. Think of the forces that are placed on the body when you golf. I mean, rotating, you're creating torque through all the segments of the spine. There's many people that shouldn't be golfing relative to the function of their muscle system that are out there trying to golf on a daily basis. And so now they golf 3 days in a row and they come in beat up. So you get them I've had clients like that. You get them activated. Literally, you fix what they broke. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, now my back doesn't hurt. And they go back and golf and they come back the next week and say, you know what, my back's sore again. And that becomes a progression that over time, you want to teach the body to continually be able to tolerate greater amounts of force so that then they can go out and golf and not shut down the muscles. The pain is related to the inhibition of muscle. Muscle tightness is first. Pain is your secondary relationship to instability or muscle dysfunction. And so depending on the person and their neuromuscular integrity coming in will dictate how long will it hold. How long will it hold dictates if somebody could only run 1 mile before they had knee pain, and then they come in, their knee pain's gone. I've had people do this and say, you know, my knee pain's back. And then they come back and say, or when they finish the story and say, yeah, but I ran 5 miles the other day and I haven't been able to run 5 miles in 5 years. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, your knee pain's back, but your tolerance level is higher because it used to not make it past a mile. Now you can make it 5 miles. That's the whole goal of MAT. Again, life's going to beat us up. From a neuromuscular standpoint, we want to put you back together. And every time we get the muscles contracting more efficiently, they have the potential to get stronger. It's kind of like jump starting your battery on your car and jump starting the battery on the car, and then you drive it. It reinforces it. But you have to jump start the muscles first. And I think that's an important component that, well, why can't we do this with exercise? You're talking about strength. Why can't we do it with exercise? Because it's all about these communication pathways between the nervous system and the muscle system. The muscles have to be able to contract and contract on demand. When you have inhibition, the associated muscles need more electrical impulse to create a muscle contraction. So that dimmer switch, again, is on those muscles. So they don't contract and contract on demand. But when we're trying to get from point A to point B, the nervous system says, I'm sending information. The muscles that get the input will get me from point A to point B. And if the ones that aren't getting proper input, they're just along for the ride. And so if you exercise with muscle inhibition, your body will compensate for muscle. The body is a great compensator. The body will get from point A to point B most efficiently with what it has to work with. If you exercise to try and strengthen muscles, because when you have these neurological weaknesses, the strong get stronger and the weak stay weak. Because the muscles that can contract and contract on demand are the ones that are going to jump in and do the job. The ones that aren't getting proper input from the nervous system are not getting strengthened. So the strong get stronger and the weak stay weak, and we end up strengthening or reinforcing our compensation pattern. And that's the first step when you think about functional exercise. The integrated system is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. And if the isolated parts aren't working effectively, everything we do in weight-bearing activity will reinforce the compensation patterns, and the strong get stronger and the weak stay weak. So we're reinforcing dysfunction many times if we have muscle weaknesses rather than improving functional capability. So the optimal time between treatment sessions. We have to consider one thing is, everything is force on the body, and how much force can the client take. When we're going through and we're checking range of motion, that's a force. I've showed earlier, stretching can cause muscle inhibition. Well, checking range of motion and range of motion, taking them in a position where there's vulnerability can be a stress on the system. Typically, we're going to see a range of motion limitation and treat the muscles associated with that limitation. So then we're doing manual muscle testing to find out which muscles we need to treat. But with the manual muscle testing, those are forces also. So somebody that's very weak, that has low integrity of their neuromuscular system, you don't want to put a lot of stress on their body. And just like exercise, they need to go back and recover. They need to heal. So you kind of put less time on a session and don't put as many forces on their body. Just get things activated and then say, okay, now, I mean, we don't need to see it. I mean, I average with clients once a week when they're coming in with any type of chronic issues or anything. Over time, I can have maintenance clients that don't come in for, I mean, on an average once every 3 to 4 weeks. But we can get an athlete, and when I work with the Broncos, I go in there a couple days a week, and I can see guys each time I'm there, because I always say you can do anything wrong with athletes and still have success with athletes because they can tolerate forces. So these forces are not I'm not worried about stretching or taking them to end ranges and putting muscle testing forces on them, because they're going out on the field and putting more forces on their body and tolerating greater amounts of force than I'll ever put on as a form of assessment and treatment. And so with athletes, I'd say you can be more regular with them, and every other day, a couple days in a row. With people that need to kind of settle in and heal, give them the time to recover, you want to spread it out more. So it varies with each individual. Yeah, so do you primarily work on the antagonist muscle, and then the opposite muscle resolves itself by activating the antagonist? Yeah, and so the key would be, yes, we're basically looking at that wherever we see a limitation in range of motion, it means that one or more of the muscles that move you in that position are potentially weak. So we're going to test and treat every muscle that crosses that axis. So, I mean, if I was talking about elbow flexion, I got the bicep, the brachialis, brachioradialis. I got flexors and extensors that cross the elbow joint, the wrists that cross the elbow joint. If they cross that axis, then they're a contributor. They may not be a primary contributor, but they have a function relative to elbow flexion. And so you have to identify, test, and treat every muscle that tests weak associated with that range of motion, whatever that may be. If I turn my head to the right, any muscle that crosses the axis for right cervical rotation needs to be tested, and anything that shows up weak, we'll treat. As you get those muscles activated through reciprocal inhibition, it sends the inhibitory response to the antagonist muscle. When you're getting that inhibitory response to the antagonist muscle, those muscles start to relax. So you think about it so many times, it's like, ooh, you're tight here, and what do? We dig into it. Well, tightness and tenderness. Pain is inflammation. If we dig into tissue that's already irritated, it can irritate the tissue more because it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. And that's why when I was, 25 years old, getting deep tissue and stretching, it's like the muscles that were being focused on were the tight ones, the ones that were sore, the ones that were inflamed, and so the ones that were irritated, and we're digging into tissues and it's like, oh yeah, do you feel that? Oh, that's tight. We need to release that. The focus is on the area that's tender and painful, and pain is inflammation. Inflammation causes inhibition. So in reality, it's like we don't want to go after the tender muscles. We want to leave those alone and let those heal. And so literally, when we change the direction of my treatment and went after the agonist muscle, so I guess in the question it would be the antagonist muscle, which is the shortening muscle, then the opposite muscles were able to lengthen. So a complete paradigm shift in my thought process as a practitioner and as a strength coach. It was a whole paradigm shift in thought process, and it changed the way I looked at the body from that point forward, and it led to the evolution and development of MAT. And it's one more minute and we'll get cut off immediately. All I want to say is thank you for taking the time to be here. You can send more questions in. If you have questions, I told you with a couple hundred people, it'd be hard to answer them all. I just know that we may have been shut off already. If not, thank you for being here and have a great day.